Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Tonight we'll be covering the art of war. We'll be continuing with chapter 10, verse 4, and then we'll try and work into, as far as we can, chapter 11. So with that, we will have one or two readings, and then we'll go to Jason's translation, and then we'll open it up for comments. So do I have any volunteers for reading? James, actually, would you do the honors, because you do it so well. So
thank you very much. I think it's this is number 4, right?
Correct.
Regard your soldiers as your children, and they will follow you into the deepest valleys. Look upon them as your own beloved sons, and they will stand by you even unto death. If, however, you are indulgent, but unable to make your authority felt, kind-hearted, but unable to enforce your commands, and incapable, moreover, of quelling disorder, then your soldiers must be likened to spoiled children. They are useless for any practical purpose.
Thank you, James. Does anyone else have a version they would like to read? If not, we'll go. Yes, Mom, will you do the honors? Or Madeline, actually.
Oh, no, I see Madeline.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's see. So, hence a commander who advances without any thought of winning personal fame and withdraws in spite of certain punishment, whose only concern is to protect his people and promote the interests of his ruler, is the nation's treasure. Because he fusses over his men as if they were infants, they will accompany him into the deepest valleys. Because he fusses over his men as if they were his own beloved son, they will die by his side. If he is generous with them, and yet they do not do as he tells them, if he loves them and yet they do not obey his command, if he is so undisciplined with them that he cannot bring them into proper order, they will be like spoiled children who can be put to no good use at all.
Thank you, Madeline. That's an interesting translation. Which version was that?
That is the Roger Ames translation.
Okay, thank you. Hey, Jason.
1 minute, just sorry. Okay, I think the translation is simple, basic, all probably the same. Paragraph 4. Regards the soldier as your babies, so they will go with you into the deep ravines. Regard the soldiers as your beloved sons, so together you can face death. If you are generous to them, but unable to direct them, if you care for them, but cannot command them, and if you cannot manage them in disordered situation, they will be like spoiled sons. There is no use for them. So I think that's it. Simple. Among, please.
Rarely do you get a good passage that's just self-explanatory, but I think this is warning the person in charge against nepotism, against favoritism, but also actually showing genuine care for those under your charge. Because the advice is to regard them as your babies or your beloved sons, but don't be over generous. Don't spoil them with your attentions. And that's striking a fine balance that I think anyone who's ever been in a position of leadership has had to jockey with before, finding that fine line between being friendly but not being a friend.
Yeah, that's excellent. That is an incredibly difficult balance to strike, even if you're thinking about an employee-employer relationship. Sometimes that can be a challenge. So, David.
Just wanted to point out a strange thing that has been said for, I think, one generation at least, about raising children. Don't try to be their friends. So even the advice towards children now, in modern times, kind of has as a strange ring against this context. I think the thing is, maybe when children have been coddled, maybe, you know, in America, there's a reputation of children being like not weaned, you know, given trophies for just participating, not really challenged. And if that's what the warning against being a mere friend, don't try to be their friend. Be a leader of even your children. So if this is saying, we know how to treat children, I'm not sure how we're reading that we understand how Chinese culture at that time was saying how to regard your children as because this is male leadership of children. So, you know, I'm asking you, culturally, you know, how do you see this? I mean, are we projecting our modern sense into this? You don't want to see your children die, but how much are your feelings tied up in them? I'm not sure. Is my question from this civilization to that.
I think let me kind of respond David's question on this one. I'm not going to talk about how today's Chinese treat their children, and when I say Chinese, I mean people in the Chinese culture. I think that's another big question. I want to talk about during this text, and we can easily apply to our education, but we don't forget that this one is still different than the education on this text, right? So the last sentence is very important, right? They will be like a spoiled son, okay? There is no use for them. So the purpose of your beloved son, like a baby, is for utilitarian reason, not like education. I want my son become somebody or be doing something, grow up or something. No. Okay, basics in this text is talking about be useful for me. Okay, I think that's in this text. Okay, so that's the key difference than real education. That's what I like to respond. You know. And of course, if you want to ask ancient time, how do they think about children or sons for education? I think different from culture to culture, and from the high-ranking noble family to the farmers' family, they all treat their offspring differently. Yeah.
Thanks for that answer very much, because it kind of resonates with the way in agricultural society, you have to be useful in it. It's not just go off and do something, you know, we can admire, but, you know, actually you have to be very useful.
Yeah, I think it's today's education, at least in my point of view, I don't want to put the useful as my label for my kids, you know. So at least that's my personal educational philosophy. But you know, but in the ancient time, the usability could be very important.
So, thank you, Jason. Next up, we have Paul.
Yeah, thanks. Just a question, Jason, about one word that stood out in your translation to me. And, you know, people were reading fast, maybe it's in the others, but I got the strongest sense from yours that they will even die, but with you, the word together. Like that you're not the commanders commanding them to death. They will even die, but you're going too, you know? And I don't hear that as strongly, even though it might be implicit in the other ones, as in yours. So I wanted your comment on that.
Thank you very much, Paul. When I work on this one, I really struggle on this translation. I very appreciate you point out this one. kind of point out that the Chinese word is 俱死. Okay, 俱 means together, all together, and then equal means, a lot of soldiers, they all die together. All the soldiers will die with me. So that's a two this kind. But I think the original meaning means I want them to die, they will die together. Does that mean I also die? I don't know. But basics, I think in the next chapter, you will see how Sun Tzu suggests a commander how to use psychology to make sure the soldier were willing to die. Okay, so I think that's the point. The English die what do I translate? The die together with you, right? That's what I said, right? So together you can face death. I think at least in my intention is when we face death together. I think that's what I meant in English, but I'm not sure I express clearly or not. It's definitely welcome for any suggestion, but that's what my intention. And I'm not sure what Amang want to say on this, but basics. I think Amang also work on this sentence for the translation as 与之.
We did a bit, and I appreciate your translation of it because I do think that it can be read in multiple ways. It reads closer to so that you can face death together, meaning you're speaking to the general and he and his soldiers. But it could also be read as directive, regard your soldiers as your beloved sons, so that you, sons, may go face death together. Either way, it sounds very apropos of Sun Tzu. And I liked that ambiguity because even the Chinese is somewhat ambiguous in that regard.
Thank you, Man. Next up, we have James.
Yeah, I just wanted to say on this issue of the metaphor of babies and sons, this means a certain kind of paternalistic relationship. In other words, what a good father would do is the way the general has to think about all the soldiers, and so in other words, they're as if they're all his children. So it's not any particular kind of relationship other than what a good parent would be like to the soldiers, and not the bad parent. I think that comes up in the last verse. If you can't give directions, if you can't give commands, if you can't manage men in disorderly situations, that will be bad. So there's that's kind of that literary device of the good soldier, the good son, and the bad son. So always treat them well, so they'll be good soldiers, and just like they're your own sons, so because they know you care about them, and then don't spoil them. So that's all. Thank
you. Great comments. So Jason, would you like to reply?
Let me make tell a story about. I think the general is Wu Qi, or famous general during that time. Okay, I just give us an example how the general treat the soldier as a baby or beloved son, right? So the one soldier, they got hurt, they have the wound, they have the pus coming out. So the general treat the soldier very well, even kneel down to suck the pus, right, to help him cure the wound. So when the soldier's mom heard this, she started crying to death, right? Because people ask why you are crying. The commander treated your son so well. She said, my husband died, okay, because he treated my husband this way. Right now, I know, my son will fight to death, in the next battle. I think that's the way of love the beloved son for utilitarian purpose.
Thank you, Jason. One interesting thing that might be worth exploring is that we talked about previously in the previous passage, the relationship between the prince and the general, and the retreat, or whether or not to push forward. And now we're talking about the relationship between the general and his troops. And I think that that's ultimately what we're talking about here, is just how these parts all interact in war, and actually how to maintain order under chaotic conditions. So I think and to be very calculated, even in how you relate to your soldiers themselves, who are putting themselves in harm's way. And a lot of this has been about calculation throughout. And I mean, number 3 also talks about calculation as well, calculation of the distances and things along those lines. But we're getting into what embodies a good soldier and what embodies a good general, and what embodies actually the relationships that actually enable you to be an effective force. So anyway, Anne, you're next.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody else notices it, but there is the implication of the passage of time, between the infancy stage and then the later sort of semi-adult son. And then there's also the terrain itself. A ravine, is a very difficult terrain, as I understand it. I don't know if anybody else sees a ravine. It's kind of a narrowed space, and he talks about those narrow spaces earlier. He's the general is in some way, strangely, the word grooming comes to mind for me, because ultimately we know that the soldier, the general, is willing to and war involves the quote sacrifice, end quote, of quite a few at that time, particularly men. And then I did think, David, what you were talking about as far as, providing a contrast between the presumably male general and his charge, and then sort of a feminine leadership style, is an interesting exploration, because often during war times, women are left at home, crying in their pillows at night, not very interested in losing their sons or husbands or what have you to conflict. So I'm not sure. I had another point, but I think that'll do it for me for now.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that. So next up, we'll go to Allison.
I was really struck by the sort of the contrast between, the relationship between the general and the soldiers back then versus today. Because I always think of, when I think of a general, I think of somebody sitting in some office room, looking at a giant TV screen, watching a war, completely removed from the reality of it. And, when you think of them as the soldiers as your sons, now the word that we always hear is collateral damage. So I don't know how much this is, what's happened with modern technology and warfare, or is that, in part the difference between China and America, because I always think of China as being much more communally oriented, and we're like incredibly highly individualistic. So it's just something that I really kind of noticed in that. Yeah.
Jason or Armand, do you wish to comment, or
Yeah, I can.
if not?
Just a little bit my thought on this one when I read this one. I think, put this way, I think we should separate the concept of soldier and warrior, right? So my feeling in the Western have the concept of warrior, okay, in the ancient time, the individual heroic, okay, this kind of thing, okay, the fighter. But China, in a way, I think it's more advanced. That's talk about, forget about morality. We talk about the warring technique is advanced during this time because the concept of soldier is strong. That's on the individual fighter. So I think that would be the different. But of course, in today, that's a totally different story. But that's my thought if I have to respond. Edison's comment.
I just think it's so beautiful to think of the soldiers as your sons, because it shows that even though they're going into war, they may die. It's so honoring their humanity that it's really just beautiful.
In this part, I appreciate your general heart, kind heart to look at this way. Unfortunately, I probably don't see it this way. I see because you probably see the word baby, beloved son probably touch you. And I see the last word, the useful, is no use for them. Okay, that one scare me because the purpose of love is usefulness.
It either says
Yeah,
something wonderful about the generals or horrible about the parenting, but the truth is probably somewhere in the middle of those two.
Yeah, I mean, the one version, useless for any practical purpose, is pretty harsh. Peter, you're next.
Yeah, I was going to also tack on what Allison was saying earlier. And this is just my personal theory. I don't have any actual data to back it up. I don't know if this is even possible to record something like this, but I suspect that as technology, I think she alluded to, got more advanced, but also I would say, I don't know if this is the best way to say it, but I think warfare also got more dangerous in the sense that there's going to be more potential for killing more people at one given time. This is not to say that warfare is not intimate when you're face to face, because I've done some research papers on, pre and post gunpowder warfare technologies, strategies, as well as how PTSD may have shifted due to technological advancement on the battlefield. But that being said, I think somewhere along the line, I think armies around the world, I think eventually looked at a general. If we're saying general, maybe I'm looking at this in a much more direct sense, the rank of general, which is very high in the army. But if we're talking about leaders, that could be a little bit flexible. So I would say that after talking with certain service members, some of my friends, they have indeed enlisted members, even not commissioned officers, they have admitted that when you reach a certain rank of a certain position, and this is the part where it might get a little bit controversial for some people, but your life is more important than the grunts. So that's essentially how my take is, according to the interviews I've had with some of my friends in the military.
Interesting comments. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to determine whether or not generals back then felt the same way. But I do think that is, it's a valid point. James, you're next.
Yeah, I was just going to give my opinion. I feel like there's a little too much made of these collectivist individualist split in social psychology. That it's kind of I don't know if it really would apply too much to this advice. In other words, we're just talking about the way a general or a commander approaches the people he's responsible to. And I think I've experienced this a lot working for different managers. There's certain managers that are fairly paternalistic and helpful to their to their employees. There's others that the ego is just there all the time. They're micromanaging and all kinds of crazy things. So the same thing applies to would apply to the military. This good advice. This is basically good advice that you treat your soldiers in the best possible way, even a paternal way, in a positive sense, making them feel that they belong to a family, together with the commander, whether their officers and yourself. And then you get a great camaraderie and spirit. And I think this applies to the American Army very well. I think I've seen, at least I've seen depictions. I think there's been very famous American commanders who spoke directly to their troops in a very personal way. And I think so it applies across the cultural boundaries. I don't think cultural boundaries are as important as sometimes they're depicted. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments. Yeah, I do think that there is actually a form of a brotherhood, so to speak, that exists in the military, that especially on with smaller units. And I think this is really about rational behavior more than anything else. And I've seen actually in smaller units, there are many documented cases where they've acted irrationally. And in certain cases with dire consequences, because they've decided to go back for someone nobly, that where it was a very high risk circumstances and they all end up losing their lives. But that's the way they view it. There's one mission I can think of in particular that's like that. But anyway, that's a little bit off topic, but it's still kind of relevant. So we'll go next with Anne, and then.
Yeah, I want to kind of fill in this idea of the so-called grooming aspect that I pointed to earlier. If you're placing infants in ravines and asking them to, with their little hands, scramble up somehow, to me, that would be a fairly bloody affair, quite dangerous, with people who can't really manage their limbs falling backwards and grabbing on things wildly to, others. It does not feel like a good situation or scenario. So I think some of the soldiers, I would agree with Jason, are being trained to be disposable products. In terms of this interesting notion of hierarchy, the paternalism, and then training the sons, the beloved sons, the infants, I don't think we have to look too far in our culture. I'm not going to give names or anything like that, but I'm familiar with men who have raised their sons in a harsh way in order to train them for the real world. Girls don't experience that. I also am familiar with many men in my life who have said that they were, they spent a long time in schoolyard scraps and being, bullied and poked and prodded and chased and kicked and punched. Yeah, I'm actually thankful, quite grateful that I was born a woman and didn't have to undergo that. And I'm wondering if, in some ways this training, for men in particular, continues to this day, sadly. I mean, no respect for our military service people. I'm just talking about sort of a broader, no disrespect is what I mean. No disrespect for our fine military service people, particularly at this time of the. In fact, yesterday I just almost spent the whole day, holding back tears. But I'm just very curious about this whole thing in Sun Tzu, and anyway, that's it.
Thank you, Anne. So maybe if everybody could keep their comments to around a minute, it would be appreciated because we want to move on and get into as much of chapter 11 as possible. So, David, sorry to limit your comments there.
Okay, I want to point out that I think we've heard similar things in an earlier section where it was brought up. So this is a counterpoint to that section. We should probably look at that and compare it about the need to treat your soldiers in a way and measure these things, that they're following orders, that they're maintaining respect, that you have maintained discipline, and you have to discipline them. And this is a recap of that message. So it's being recapped for some reason. It's adding something onto that message. So I think this is saying, and it did talk about having a favorable attitude towards them before, but here it's sort of talking about them, even familial connection. So, you know, it's raising those stakes, but then putting the same boundary. You can't lose the control and the discipline and the respect, and they have to follow you almost blindly unto death. Second thing I want to mention, the persona is important. Like George Washington showing up and turning around the troops, when he showed his face, it meant something. So role is significant. I have a feeling that back here, it's not just a matter of like the US Army, the officer who has the stripes, the bars is the boss, but it's actually more, it's even a personal thing, that there's a value to how they've obtained their rank and they stand, it means something significant when that person is telling you, no, do this now. So that's the second thing. And one third thing is this, that is about rational behavior. Joe, you talked about that. So there's two aspects. The rational behavior, it's not exactly rational. It has to be also conforming to order, even then when you don't know why, when your commander is telling you to do what you didn't think you should now be doing, you turn around and start doing that because the commander is higher, has the higher view, is up higher, looking over the whole thing and weighing a higher value. So it's not rational to you, but it's rational to stay in the order of command. Maybe there are exceptions to that. We haven't talked about that. So I'm saying the general has important. A value in being over the other people. So there's something, I think that's all I want to say.
That's a very important point. And then even if we go back to the idea of the moral law causes the people to be in complete accord with their ruler. You can replace that with general, so that they will follow him regardless of their lives, undismayed by any danger. That's not rational for the soldier, but it is rational for the general. So the distinction is actually, and it would be rational for the nation as a whole. So it is an important distinction. As the individual, it wouldn't be necessarily. Well, I mean, depends on your, I guess, your value system. Anyway, Ocean, and then we'll go and we'll move on.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. It's an interesting concept to treat or appear to treat your soldiers or employees like the family members. You know, the corporations say, "Oh, you guys are our family members." You know, it's all bullshit. But yeah, but make them keep repeating over and over again. Adolf Hitler said, "Even if it's a lie, if you keep pounding to stupid people's ears." Pounding a million times, that lie becomes a truth. So if you keep telling your soldiers, "You are my son, you are my son," they start to believe it because many of them are naive. But the historical fact is that if you take a look at one of the greatest Russian generals, Zhukov, who defeated Hitler, actually, he treated like soldiers, the hundreds of soldiers like nothing, you know. And same thing for Mao Zedong. He was a great war general. You know, during the time of the independence, and you know, he one time said, you know, if we're gonna go war with United States, you know, United States has so much nuclear, they can drop nuclear bombs. And he said, no, not a big deal. We have 1 billion people. If the U.S. nuclear bomb killed 90% of us, we still have 100 million people, more than enough people, and laughing at. So for him, killing he himself historically killed over 70 million innocent people. So in his eyes, dying of 900,000 innocent Chinese mean nothing. That's the nature of that. So I agree with what Peter said. if you become high rank enough, people at the bottom means like nothing, like a cockroach, nothing. It's expendable. It's like a thing, like nails, tools. Just the tools to use. That's all. Thank you.
It's like Stalin, one person's a tragedy, 20 million
Correct.
statistic.
Correct.
Madeline.
Yes, something you were saying, Joe, I can't remember exactly what, that made me think of this. It was quite some time ago in one of these meetups. Maybe it was the OODA loop discussion. It was about making sure that people knew what was going on 2 levels above them, 1 level above and 2 levels above. So that if you lost your commanding officers, people could move up in the ranks and still function. Does anyone else remember this?
I don't recall it just offhand, but I mean, I think that's essential as far as if you're talking about survivability. When you're, I mean, and that's essentially the OODA loop, right? It's a survivability mechanism. So yeah, I mean, in this case, it's a fail-safe that you actually understand the objective of the mission and your role in it. And if 1 or 2 people above you were to be lost, that you're able to actually execute still. So for your own personal safety.
Yeah, and I thought Peter's point was a good one, because the commander's knowledge is so specialized, and presumably they are a competent and experienced person who has an overview of everything. But it's still needed to have people who can move up in the ranks if necessary.
Thanks, Madeline. And we'll go to John and then we'll move on. Hi, John.
Hi, Joe. Hi, everyone. Yeah, look, I just wanted to make a quick comment in regards to the beloved children, the idea of the general and his disposition, and perhaps picking up on that comment about George Washington. I think it's more than a disposition. It goes to the first chapter of the book that talks about the way, and which causes people to be in accord with the ruler. Thus they'll die with him or live with him and not fear danger. And so I think that the idea of treating your troops like beloved children also comes down to your intentions for them. And so in George Washington's case, they were fighting for a republic, the only country founded on ideals. If you're trying to provide a better future for your children, then you're honestly trying to do that. You're not doing that with a view to an ideology or a dogma. You're actually doing that with a view to progress. And that progress, which is almost fundamental to the reading of this book, given that it's the initial estimations of the book, I think it slants all of the things that follow, including the idea of treating the general treating their troops like children. So I think that the test then isn't that they're just dispositionally treating them in a familiar way. That perhaps also goes to that issue about corporations saying it but not doing it, because the question is, are they really standing for principles that a father would want for their children? And of course, you could argue, certainly in the War of Independence, America was, maybe in subsequent wars, not so much. So the measure of what those wars are fought for, the intention, the way, I think measures in on how you might read that issue of beloved children in regards to generals.
Yeah, I think identifying with the mission actually is critical, as just as much as the relationships with the generals themselves. So with that, thank you for that, John. With that, we'll move on to verse 5. Sorry, I didn't have it up. I think it's 5. So James, will you do the honors?
Oh, certainly. Thank you. This is the translation by Lionel Giles, by the way. If we know that our own men are in a condition to attack, but are unaware that our enemy is not open to attack, we have gone only halfway toward victory. If we know that the enemy is open to attack, but are unaware that our own men are not in a condition to attack, we have only gone halfway towards victory. If we know that the enemy is open to attack, and also know that our men are in a condition to attack, but are unaware that the nature of the ground makes fighting impracticable, we are still gone only halfway toward victory. Hence, the experienced soldier, once in motion, is never bewildered. Once he has broken camp, he is never at a loss. Hence, the saying, if you know the enemy and know yourself, your victory will not stand in doubt. If you know heaven and know earth, you may make your victory complete.
Thank you for that, James. So next up, Madeline, would you mind reading again? Or if not, we can, Aman will.
Sure, unless someone else has a version they want to read. No? Okay.
Nope. Thank you.
Okay. To know our troops can attack and yet be unaware that the enemy is not open to attack reduces our chances of victory to half. To know the enemy is open to attack and yet be unaware that our own troops cannot attack reduces our chances of victory again to half. To know the enemy is open to attack and our troops can attack, and yet be unaware that the terrain does not favor us in battle, reduces the chances of victory once again to half. Thus, when one who understands war moves, he does not go the wrong way. And when he takes action, he does not reach a dead end. Hence it is said, know the other, know yourself, and the victory will not be at risk. Know the ground, know the natural conditions, and the victory can be total.
Thank you for that, Madeline.
Okay, so 10.5. I think that's sometimes we see that's a common problem in the ancient text. I think there. I don't know, how do you feel on the first part? Let me read it. If we know that our soldiers are able to attack, but are unaware that the enemy is unattackable, the chances of winning are only half. If we know that the enemy is attackable, but are unaware that our soldiers are unable to attack, the chances of winning are only half. If we know that the enemy is attackable and that we are able to attack, but are unaware that the form of terrain, I think I should change to the land, or I change it, but unaware that the land form is not suitable for fighting, the chances of winning are only half. I think this sentence is not my fault because I just try to translate word by word, but basics they are, Sun Tzu is talking about you need to make sure your enemy are open to attack, or I call it attackable. And our soldier in our souls, we are ready to attack. These two are not enough. You also need to know the land form is suitable for fighting. Then you can win, right? But unfortunately, I think it's the same situation also happened in Plato's dialogue. You will see a lot of lengthy description. If this, then this. If this, then this. Because they don't have syllogism or Aristotelian kind of logic there. So the description is very lengthy. So I think that's what they want to talk about. But that's good. At the end, Sun Tzu summarized very well. Second sentence. Therefore, those who know military operations are not bewildered when they move and have inexhaustible possibilities when they attack. I think this sentence I translated a little bit different. A lot of translation I don't remember how the author usually talk about when they move, they are not losing or something, but I think that means they when they move, they are very clear what they need to move. That's why it says it's not bewildered or not lost. But when they attack, they have the many possibilities, many ways to do it. And the enemy cannot know, cannot predict what am I going to do. I think that's what he want to talk about. So they say when they move, they are not bewildered, not confused. So they are very clear what they want to move. But when they attack, the enemy doesn't know because I have many possibilities to move. So the enemy cannot know what am I going to do. I think that's the sentence means. Finally, hence the conclusion. If you know yourself and the other, your victory is reachable. If you know heaven and the earth, your victory is guaranteed. So basically, the important message here is talking about the earth, right? Because the subject of this chapter is about land form. I remember at the beginning talking about the heaven, the Tao, the heaven, the earth, the general, and the method. So here it's talk about the earth, and the next chapter is also refocus on the earth, because heaven usually we don't have too much control on that, and the earth we cannot change it, but we should be able to be, at least it's fixed there. We should be able to do a lot of things to based on what kind of landform we are facing. Yeah, thank you, Amang.
Thank you, Jason. And just rereading this last verse, it makes me think back to our conversation about who is the target audience? Who is Sun Tzu writing for? If I had any evidence that he only wanted a ruler to read so far, this verse would be that evidence. This is a summation of everything up to this point, and the nitty-gritty details come next. So there's almost a disavowal, an ability to say, yeah, I read it all the way up until we talked about the ugly stuff. So here, you're my general. You read those last 3 chapters. I got what I need to out of this, because this sums up virtually everything that the Sun Tzu has been arguing so far. And that first half of it reads, like Jason was talking about syllogisms, it's a logic puzzle, but that is what conflict is a logic puzzle. And so read it, reread it. If we know that our soldiers are able to attack, but unaware that the enemy is unattackable. Okay, so if A, then B, then here's the formula. It reads as a logic puzzle because the message is war is a puzzle of combating rationale and combating intelligence. So skip number 1 because I'm a spoiled princeling and I couldn't make heads or tails of it. Therefore, those who know military operations are not bewildered when they move. Okay, so my general should know what he's doing and have inexhaustible possibilities when they attack. All right, so he presents me with lots and lots of plans. That's a good sign. And if you know yourself and the other, oh, I heard that before. Know thy enemy, know thyself. Your victory is reachable. But if you also know heaven and earth, it's guaranteed. You need to factor all these things together to be good at this. So get down off your chariot, get back in your throne room, sit down, hand the last 3 chapters to your general and make him do the hard study. Because what comes from here, didn't I just see a chapter coming up about how to use fire? Do we set fire to soldiers? Yes, sir. I don't want to know anything about that. I can almost actually see the dialogue happening in a throne room, happening around this text, and the pedagogical genius in writing this text and putting the summary here. For the get out of jail free card, you don't have to actually admit to having the dirty knowledge of how you paid for spies or how you used fire on the battlefield, because these are dishonorable acts. And Sun Tzu's bottom line is honor schmonor. The important thing is, if you're committing to this war, that was the worst decision you could have made in the first place. But now that you've made it, anything and everything is on the table to end it as swiftly and as decisively as possible, so that it doesn't come back to haunt you, and more importantly, doesn't come back to haunt your people a generation or even 2, 3, 4 years from now, because that was becoming the norm. Vendetta upon vendetta upon vendetta. You're muted, Joe.
Excellent points as always. And no, I think it's worth coming back to this idea of actually, kind of ending something swiftly, because that's something that's been reoccurring throughout. The idea of a prolonged war was one of the earlier chapters as what is to be avoided under all circumstances. So that's a great point. And in having knowledge of both yourself and your enemy and their weaknesses will actually prevent that prolonged war. So great points. Thank you, Jenny. Jenny, you're next. Or thank you, Aman. Jenny, you're next.
Am I next?
Please.
This is Jenny. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm just curious, being somebody who has never been in a war, and I don't think I would ever be in a war. So I'm just wondering if this art of war technique could be applied to in the art of living in our day-to-day life, in the way we live our life. To more practical applicability to our daily living, I'm thinking. Yes?
Absolutely. Yes, it has a lot of practical aspects to when you're talking about timing, where you're talking about understanding the terrain, relationships, just with the example that we just used with the general's relationship with their troops could also be analogous to a manager's relationship to their employees. So kind of, you need to strike a balance. You want to be, friends with them, but you can't be, too good of friends. And so there are a lot of uses of this in business in general. So throughout the text, you'll definitely see there are, and actually Quan has made a very good case in the past as it is a philosophy of life, actually. So that's that he outlined the principles that are highlighted in chapter 1 and how they can be used to guide any kind of decisions.
Aman just said teachers to students, directors to actors. Yeah, very good. Thank you, Aman. Yeah. Mr. Handsome. Oh, yeah.
You're not the first person who said that, Jenny. So it's.
No. I remember the very first time I met him, the whole meeting agreed that Aman is always the most good-looking man in the meeting. So
yeah, but now that Jenny's read the
art, she fails to mention I didn't show my face for about the first 8 months, and that's why.
I think you heard the other gentleman already.
Well, I was always impressed by the backflip. So I mean,
actually, it was Joe. You made that. It was you, Joe, who made that compliment about Aman. It was you.
Yeah, it was actually I was working on Envy that week, so I was on my emotions. So yes, David.
Right. Okay. I guess I'm looking at Aman's comments and thinking, well, there's some stuff coming that they put all this in a different perspective. And so this may sound or read differently if we come back to it after reading the next 3 chapters. So I'm a little hazy on what that balance is going to change. It's interesting how you described it. But so just from what we've seen so far, this seems to be a kind of summing up and affirming that you are, whatever your position, you have to be taking all these 3 salient issues into account. The way your troops are, the way the other troops are. And you might think that's enough, that there's something maybe bigger, equally, or even bigger in the balance, because even when that dynamic is all ready for everything, you know, even if you're the stronger force or if you're the weaker force and found your opportunity, it has to be on the right battlefield at the right, you know, in the right way. So you can, as the weaker force, I think, be avoiding defeat, waiting for the victory, because you're biding your time, waiting for when your operation can take effect. But it's all depending on heaven and earth, because you know yourself, you know your enemy. It's saying these are the 3 forces of war, the 3 areas, and you have to have the 3 legs standing for this stool to stand, you know. And you're taking everything into account when you've done this. So yeah, why are there more chapters? It's interesting. Thanks.
Good comments, David. So next up we Paul.
Yeah, Aman's comments changed my thoughts, because I was going to ask why he used these fractions that seem to me to contradict earlier statements, or we should consider the earlier statements along with them, that in those earlier chapters, he said, a good general already knows he's going to win, and he doesn't go to battle without overwhelming, you know, having all those things in his favor. And now he only reduces his odds by half. So I'm just curious about that. And then secondly, maybe to Aman's point, it almost sounds like the book has a hidden agenda. This is probably not true, but just to put it on the table, to give the general ammunition so that he can point to his prince when he knows he shouldn't fight. He goes, see what the Art of War says? It says, you know, we reduced by half. It's kind of a naive statement that he can use to have latitude to still attack, because then he can go, but we're going to overshadow them, you know, we're going to compensate for that this way. Or he can say, we're not attacking, and it's all consistent with the book. But just that half is very intriguing to me. So thoughts? Thank you.
That's an interesting question. Jason or Aman?
Let me respond, and I hope Aman will share his thought. I really appreciate what Paul talking about. It's contradict, but I don't see this way. Okay, so I'm not sure, because I'm reading original Chinese, or I have some the historical background or literature background in Chinese, or I didn't do a good translation. Not all possible, right? So my understanding is, before you say you already know you are winning, then you start to fight. But the focus is on the second part. You don't fight, then looking for winning. I think that's the focus should be on the second part. Just like when we do business plan, right? We make a plan, we are going to make money. Then we execute the plan. But nobody guarantee you really make money. But you need to know you are winning, you are making money. Then you can execute. You don't like start the business. Let me try to make more money. So I think that's on the previous section. Right now, you are in the process of executing your winning plan, okay? So during this process, you should know yourself. You should know your enemy. And you should also know the situation, okay? So-called the landform. Then you can win. So in my understanding, I don't see conflicts. I see the previous one more on the metaphor, on the higher principle, and then the focus is the second part, you don't fight, then think about winning. You should not have a winning plan, then you start to fight. Right now, you are talking about the fighting part. That means I know I'm winning and I don't do anything, then it automatically wins. So I think that's the part I think.
Jason, you muted right at the end.
That's not important. Okay, so I'm out.
I think
But this makes me think of that absolutely sage piece of philosophy from the sound philosopher Mike Tyson, who said, everyone has a plan until they get hit. This is a reiteration, because if you're now in the thick of actual combat, you don't have time to flip back and say, you told me I was going to. Here you need a thumbnail to tell you. Did you take into account your odds of winning? Did you take into account the other person's attack ability? Did you look at the land? You really should look at the land. It was really important that you looked at, I know you think you looked at the land, but look at it again, because whatever your plan was, now you've been hit. Now you have to go back to your original vision and reorient your plan to have it actually be executed effectively. I think there are layers of pedagogical genius to this text, because it can be used. I can picture it in the hands of a prince. I can picture it in the hands of a general. I can picture it in the hands of a lieutenant. I can picture it in the grunts around the campfire going over single passages of it to discuss, well, he says we should be using fire on these days because that's when the wind's going to be. I mean, the idiosyncrasies of it are genius, and they were of a time and place. But what makes it timeless is, like Jason was saying about, you have a business plan. Now you've launched your business plan. Now something's come up that the FDA wants to inspect your, Theron machine there, Miss Holmes. And yeah, now let's go back to the drawing board and see, what did we originally think? Did we do the right plan? Did we have the right vision? Did we put together the right logistics? And if you're honest with yourself and something's off, you know what that off point is. If you're dishonest with yourself and you're really just trying to keep the presentation going, you're taking you and all of the fellows with you, all your soldiers, all your employees down the drain.
excellent comments by both. I very much appreciated what Jason's distinction as well. It's like this chapter seems to be not only, it's like more of a framework of once you're in battle, and that the previous ones are actually like kind of principles that we're functioning under. So we'll go to Ocean, John, and then James.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, lots of interesting points have made by everybody, and point by point. So Ginny asked, art of living, how you can apply this in everything. Life is a war. I mean, think about it. Unless you are retired and you're kind of living under the good retirement plan, everybody's on a warfield. I mean, I have many CEOs, entrepreneur levels, and their mindset is exactly like the generals described in the Sun Tzu, because they're fighting against other competitors, or in occasions like a big giants like a Google's and so forth. And 9 out of 10 in this world end up in a failure in business. And we have like over 40 million Americans are currently on the food stamps, or the countless number of the homeless people. They are the proof that they are eaten alive by the system. So life is a war, and so we need to have this kind of mentality. If I had to summarize in one word, and the entire Sun Tzu is due diligence. Do the due diligence. If you fail, no amount of fire or arsenals you have is useless. So so know yourself, know your capability, and know others. And that's it, pretty much. Thank you.
Thank you, Ocean. Next up, we have John.
Yes, I agree with that application of this treatise can be in any area of life and business. In terms of this passage, my reading of just addressing what Paul was saying, my reading was of the halfway to victory when you look at the troops in the first instance, and then the nature of the terrain. For me, two halves make a whole, and so for me, this was in fact an assessment of heaven and earth. So the terrain part really talks to earth, the other part talks to heaven. And what that's about, and this is very important in our geopolitical environment today, because the heaven aspect, though that was addressed in an earlier chapter, which I wasn't present for, is in my mind a spiritual consideration. And I'm not talking theology, but rather a raison d'etre, your reason for being. What's the meaning of what you're doing? And so when we're talking about knowing the opponents, yes, we're talking about knowing yourself and your opponents. We are talking about terrain, but we're also talking about terrain at different levels. So we're not just talking about physical terrain, and that could be pointed to earlier in the book when there's a discussion about the types of attacks, the highest form being attacking your opponent's plans, then their alliances, then their armies, and then their cities. And so when we're talking about armies and cities, I think we're talking about terrain, but when we're talking about plans and alliances, we're talking about heaven. And of course, when we're talking about plans and alliances in heaven, there is also a terrain aspect to that too. So these configurations in this chapter describe those arrangements, which are theoretical, not physical. And it's also the case that the heaven aspects apply to the terrain. That is, troops feel better when they're in stronger configurations of terrain, and they feel worse when they're not. They feel more exposed, less morale. And the reason this is, I think, a very important part of the book is because it goes, as I said, to the geopolitical issues. So if we understand that plans and alliances are the highest form of attack, we can understand why America's been so successful, because arguably they've taken more territory in McDonald's franchises than they have with their army. And how have they done that? They have plans, they form alliances called franchise groups. They create armies of people to do it, and then they build cities, which are their McDonald's restaurants all around the place. That's just one example. If we talk geopolitically, we're saying, okay, what is the heaven aspect in relation to a particular reason for being? And when we're talking about nations, we're talking about their stated ambitions, their constitutional directions. Of course, the United States is the only country founded on ideals that are written down. And the United States has a unique situation in that they also have a separation of powers, which doesn't just include the three branches of government, but also, I'd argue, the hundreds of thousands of millionaires and billionaires that make up all the resource controlling corporations that are run out of America. Every time an iPhone's made, Apple makes $1,200, the Chinese manufacturer makes $300. So for every iPhone that's made, by virtue of focusing on plans, Apple makes 4 times the value, and America does, by not making it, as opposed to what China does when they do make it. And so for this reason, I think that the issue of heaven is very important, because it can be argued right now that America is facing a crossroad. I'd argue any student of American history would say they've always faced this crossroad. It's a never-ending contest of ideas, but at least those ideas are written down and stated and are argued out in the open. And as I said, I'd personally, if I'm looking at heaven in terms of and heaven and earth, and I'm looking at the geopolitical aspects of plans, alliances, armies, and cities. And if I had to pick a country that should be leading and a country that we should then be following, and I'm an Australian, so I live in a country that doesn't have even our own flag. We've got in one corner of our flag, we've got the flag of another country. Right? We can't even defend ourselves. So you have to understand my position isn't one that I can speak to say that my country's doing this, but perhaps the reason that Australians look to America is because we share some of those principles, especially the separation of powers. And that's very much a factor of heaven. And the configurations that we talk about, if you think about why it is that entrepreneurs go to California to pursue their businesses globally, the Elon Musks of the world. You can come back to those, 6 types of configurations of terrain and understand how the environment itself, in a conceptual fashion, can also present opportunities or not. For all of the, this particular text, of course, originated out of China, so we have to respect the way of thinking that is, I think, very profound in this book, which continues in the Chinese culture, and yet at a political level, I'd argue that the lack of a separation of powers in that particular polity is the very issue that's addressed here in terms of the heaven, as opposed to just the earth. It's one thing to say, oh, one country is doing better than the other on a physical manifestation, but at the level of plans and alliances, why would people get involved? Why would people follow the way? And I think, just to finish, this is a very important thing right now while we're looking at the challenge to democracy that's occurring in America, because there's a school of thought in America that says we can just be stronger by being autocratic. And I'd simply suggest that in the very strict reading of this passage, well, heaven wouldn't be on your side in that way, and you would certainly, earlier in the chapter, fall into a constricted configuration, if not a stalemated one. So it strikes me that democracy is the only way out of the human dilemma, and it also strikes me that that's made immediately apparent in this text if you read heaven to be theoretical as well as physical in terms of terrain. Thanks.
Thank you, John. So we'll move on to James.
I was going to say what John said, except that it's really the first half of what John said. I think at the point at which it became political, I have a lot of disagreements. I think the first thing is that, the United States is not the only country that has a constitution and has people that write books and have ideas. This is basically an international culture, is an international effort. So just basically you lost me there, and the notions of helplessness for Australia, military helplessness, I don't understand that, but I don't live there, so I haven't shared that historical experience. But it's a big world, and everyone contributes. Everyone in the world needs to contribute and pull their weight, in my opinion. I wanted to comment on this point that's made here, and that is that this is about awareness. We have to be aware of these things, an attackability, the basically inability, and the basically not being able to correlate the landform with opportunities on the ground. Previously, the author said that many things have to be taken into account. Many different calculations have to be made. Knowledge of the heaven and earth, which is absolutely correct. Knowledge of heaven and earth, but also the positives and negatives of managing large groups of men on the ground, and different styles of terrain, and what operations are more favorable than others, and so forth. So and this is why I guess Jason was saying earlier that we have to have read the other chapters in the book. We have to know that the author really intends for us to have a complete mastery of military strategy and tactics. Thank you.
Thank you, James, as well. So next up, we have Mark, followed by Ocean.
Thanks, Joseph. It's great to hear everybody's ideas on this. I heard, I think it was David mention a three-legged stool, and I can certainly understand in reading the end of chapter 10 that it may sound like that. Know yourself, know your enemy, and know your army, maybe. Then I heard that it can be reduced to one idea, due diligence. And I'm wary of this kind of reductionism. In chapter 1, we start with 5 principles. And these are very complex, each one of them. The moral law, heaven, earth, the commander, method, and discipline. I'm a little skeptical of, John, what you were saying about heaven. You were saying not necessarily spiritual, maybe conceptual. And each time we try to pin down what heaven is, we may be sort of twisting the art of war in some way. The word heaven, as far as I can tell in the English translation, only occurs 6 times. And we're not told very much about it, except that it signifies night and day, cold and heat, and times and seasons. We can perhaps supplement that with maybe something like Quan would probably be able to do with respect to the I Ching, and understand something about the relationship between heaven and earth in that way. But each of these 5 principles that we have set out at the beginning is multifarious as well. So I'm just a little concerned about trying to reduce the art of war to something in that sense. Thanks.
Thank you for your comments,
I'm-
Mark.
If I can, I'm
Go
going to
ahead,
dive right on
please.
top, just to say real quick. I agree with both of you, because I think what Mark's getting at was something I said last time about Sun Tzu's attempt to develop a system of systems, something that is grossly complex and well ahead of his time in many ways. But I also agree with what John said about due diligence, because what I think the advice is that is all you can do due to this complexity. And it gives no guarantee. It is merely your best possible chance. The only guarantee you've got, it was right back way at the beginning of chapter 1. Don't do this at all. Don't engage in the conflict. Avoiding the conflict is the guarantee of success if you measure success in terms of life lost and treasure spent. Otherwise, it's all a bit of a gamble. And there are so many things to account for that all you can do is try to factor in as much knowledge, as much information as possible into your variables, into your equations, and hope that you got enough of them.
Yeah, excellent point. I think that, yeah, systems layered on top of systems is a perfect way of actually addressing that.
Yeah,
ahead,
let me make a comment on this one. Mark, thank you very much for your comment. Always very difficult to respond. I have to agree. Okay, it's a reduce to the 5 principle and then blah, blah, blah. But I think in our today's Western world, if you want to write a textbook about art of war, you probably will label 5 parts, not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and 6. First one is introduction. They have the 5 part, the Tao, the heaven, the earth, the general, the method, and they blah blah blah. They have the 5 part. Each one they have 10 chapter, and that probably will satisfy everybody. But I'm not going to defend Sun Tzu's writing. But my point is that's why at the beginning I start to talk about the audience change, and the second thing just continue from what I'm talking about. You can avoid in the first 2, 3 chapters. Right now, you already passed that point, right? You cannot avoid the war. You have to go to the war field. Then that's all the dirty thing you have to do because you already decide you're not going to do that. Okay. So I think that's the situation, and the criticize is valid, but that's what it is, and that's what we are dealing with. That's why last time almost make a joke. we should forbid new people to join on the chapter 12, because if you jump in, you say, what's going on? You guys are setting fire. So
Excellent comments. So we'll go to Ocean next.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so in order to respond to Mark, I think Mark made a question there. I was the one actually who said this entire book can be summarized or reduced to the due diligence. I'm the one who said it, and he's questioning that because he's talked about how about the morals and so forth. Yeah, let me explain. So to me, so due diligence is nothing other than the intelligence. And we can go back, come back to why United States has been the most powerful country in the world. Because we have the CIA. CIA is, you can argue which is better, Mossad or the MI6, but CIA is definitely the greatest intelligence. That's why we maintain the world status quo. If you read the book, The Confession of the Economic Hitman by John Perkins, who was a former CIA black operator and who had killed many, foreign important figures who doesn't go along with the interest of the national interest of the United States, and and killed those people, and so we get to exploit their resources, like South American countries, and keep the people in there at the standard of the Stone Age. And I personally had dated with one mistress, a Japanese girl, who was one of the mistresses of one of the largest mafia family in Japan. And she told me,
can you relate this back to the passage that we're working on? You started off by talking about due diligence.
Due diligence is everything, because why the United States is the greatest example of the master of the art of war and intelligence, because the CIA. Japan is the largest up until recent years. Japan is the the United States has not filed a bankruptcy, because Japan keep it out. Japan is the highest T-bond holders, trillions of dollars of buying to save the United States. Why? Because all the politicians who are patriotics all killed by the mafia family that I had dated with the girls, the largest family members, mafia family, who holds the greatest assassins, and they got order from the CIA to kill certain Japanese prime ministers, politicians who say no to the Washington D.C. and protect the interests of the Japanese people. Those politicians are all eliminated covertly by the intelligence. So that's part of the reason the United States has to be the most powerful country. In the art of war, yes, it's very dirty and sneaky. But that's how you get the power, worldly power. And so summarized to due diligence, in order to answer to the question of the Mark, how about the moral? Okay, how to keep the morale of your soldiers by assessing and knowing how motivated your people is and how motivated your the opponent soldier is. It's all due diligence, all intelligence. So information, mind reading is everything in war, nothing more. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just restate. I really think Amon captured it well when he said this is the systems on top of a system. So there is a reduction a certain amount of reduction that can be done. So anyway, John.
Yes, look, just to address a few of those points, perhaps I'll pick up on Amon's point first, the system on systems, what you were just saying, Joe. And I think that this is an important point. And the proposition that there's a reductionist approach whenever you start trying to arrive at conclusions out of the text, or if you apparently are ascribing to a particular phrase. So I think Mark mentioned heaven and said it was, I think, mentioned 6 times in the text. So then there's this idea that somehow it's reductionist or perhaps you're going beyond what the text says. I think the text asks us to do that. It tells us to make comparative evaluations of the very things that we're talking about, and it does that right up front. And for that reason, we have tools about us today, which Sun Tzu didn't have in those times. I mean, this book is written in parables. It's circular, and there's a lot of circles in all the texts. And full disclosure, I spent 3 years full time writing an algorithm to deconstruct this book and to try to correlate all the different variables, of which there's over 800, well over 800, and all the functions, which are over 110. And when you take a more sophisticated approach using the knowledge we have today to this text, you can, through the relationships of aspects in the text, arrive at much deeper meanings for each of these points. Now, you could argue that certainly that's not what, maybe Sun Tzu didn't say it, it's not written down. And yet Sun Tzu is implying so many things in this text, but the thing he's implying the most is to make comparative evaluations, and that you must do so at the very highest degree, because war is the greatest affair of the state. And so on that basis, if we don't do those things, well, then we're not actually taking on board anything he's saying at first principles. And once you do take a more complex approach to it, rather than being reductionist, it's expansive, because anytime you try to link variables together, it tends to have an exponential outcome. And that by definition is not reductionist, it's expansive, it's the opposite. You see more, not less. And so with regards to, I think that tackles the systems on systems and the reductionist discussion. With regards to heaven, Mark, I understand why in reading the text you would say what you say about heaven. Indeed, in the text, it's not commented on specifically in more than a handful of occasions. And yet it's mentioned as a crux. It's mentioned as almost one of the primary principles by which you should read the text. And on that basis, when you dive much deeper into trying to connect those relationships, it's apparent that we are talking about two things in this book in terms of the human condition. And philosophers have told us this as well. One's the physicalism, our physical reality, and the other is our cognitive reality, our our perception beyond our physicalism, and Descartes called it dualism, and when we look at that and when we read into it and look at the relationships, heaven, if you like, is the area of the discussion that captures our consciousness. It's the area that captures human consciousness. We know that robots at this stage aren't just fighting on the battlefield, it's people. And yes, the physicality of what surrounds them and their preparations will count. But equally what counts is what's in their mind. And so when we talk about the politics, I mean, I've made comments of politics not because I wanted to be political, but rather because if the premise of this book is the art of war is the greatest affair of the state, well, we are talking literally about the affairs of state when we consider this book. And my comment about Australia was simply, and I appreciate, sorry, am I going too long?
Yeah. We're going to try. We want to really try and get into chapter 11. Chapter 11 is very long. So in order to just cover
chapter 11 today.
Yeah, we're going to try and get in. So David, if you could be brief, and then we're going to move right in.
Wow. So I'm going to almost handle nothing of anything John mentioned, because he mentioned 100 things. But I was going to say a while back, I put in a comment that we talked about due diligence. We talked about intelligence, and I mean, awareness was the word James Cook used. So yes, this is pointing to you have due diligence would be your awareness of these essential key structures or systems. We talked about how your enemy and how your army, each of which is a fully, embodied functioning spiritual entity, how they're each functioning and what each of them is like and ready for in confronting each other. And this other entity, which is the earth. Actually, it's not 3 pillars, it's 4 pillars. And like we said, heaven is even an aspect here. So, which is something you have to keep in mind. Something has to be part of consciousness. Something has to be your awareness. And this is, we've talked about spirit. So I think all of that's considered here. So all these are the same thing. And it's the general's job to be the calculative contributor at the top of the motion of this project if they're told to go to war. And so this general has to calculate in all the dimensions. It's not just intelligence though. It's not just due diligence. You have to have force. That force has to move a certain way. So you have to actually have discipline built in. You have to have a certain relationship created in order to have a force, an armed force. And you have to recognize what the other force is like in their shape and their responsiveness. And these are live things. So it's not just intelligence, it's also training and spirit. So, called doing all that due diligence, now you're subsuming everything. Due diligence is just everything. That's all. Just one second.
Cool. Thanks. Appreciate it, David. So why don't we jump right into chapter 11 and try and get at least number 1 done. It's quite long, and so we can give us a chance to finish this within chapter 11 within 2 sessions, 2.1 sessions.
Okay, I'll start. This is called the 9 situations. Sun Tzu said, the art of war recognizes 9 varieties of ground. 1, dispersive ground. 2, facile ground. 3, contentious ground. 4, open ground. 5, ground of intersecting highways. 6, serious ground. 7, difficult ground. 8, hemmed in ground. 9, desperate ground. When a chieftain is fighting in his own territory, it is dispersive ground. When he has penetrated into hostile territory, but to no great distance, it is facile ground. Ground, the possession of which imports great advantage to either side, is contentious ground. Ground on which each side has liberty of movement is open ground. Ground which forms the key to 3 contiguous states, so that he who occupies it first has most of the empire at his command, is a ground of intersecting highways. When an army has penetrated into the heart of a hostile country, leaving a number of fortified cities in its rear, it is serious ground. Mountain forests, rugged steeps, that's what it says, marshes and fens, all country that is hard to traverse, this is difficult ground. Ground which is reached through narrow gorges, and from which we can only retire by tortuous paths, so that a small number of the enemy would suffice to crush a large body of our men, this is hemmed in ground. Ground on which we can only be saved from destruction by fighting without delay is desperate ground. On dispersive ground, therefore, fight not. On facile ground, halt not. On contentious ground, attack not. On open ground, do not try to block the enemy's way. On the ground of intersecting highways, join hands with your allies. On serious ground, gather and plunder. In difficult ground, keep steadily on the march. On hemmed-in ground, resort to stratagem. On desperate ground, fight.
Thank you very much for that, James. That was a mouthful, to say the least. So, Madeline, or would you mind reading the next one, or?
Actually, I also listened to a different audiobook version, and I can see my written version on this one isn't very good. So maybe someone would like to go.
Anne, would you like to go ahead and read number 11.1?
Yes, and stop me if I've passed the passage James read. Okay, it's the 9 grounds. Sun, the master, said, in respect to the conduct of war, there are 9 grounds. Distracting ground is when the army fights in its own land. Disturbing ground is when the army fights just a short distance into the enemy's territory. Ground of contention is land in which whoever has control of that land is of an advantage. Intersecting ground is land that either army has access to. Path-ridden ground is similar to intersecting ground, but can be 3 or more provinces intersecting. Deeply involved ground is land in the interior of the enemy's lands with its many fortified towns. Difficult ground is terrain that is mountainous, forested, ravines, cliffs, marshes, and swamps. Enclosed ground is ground that is narrow to enter and exit, such as narrow valleys and canyons. This reduces the head of the army to a small volume and therefore more vulnerable to great force. Death ground is any terrain that results in the army being slowed and delayed, which can lead to disaster and defeat. So don't fight the distracting ground. Do not linger on disturbing ground. Do not attack disputed land if the enemy is in possession of it. Do not block the highways in intersecting ground. At the intersections of highways in intersecting land, invite discourse with the enemy. When in deeply involved lands, collect as many of the enemy's assets as possible. When on difficult ground, depart as quickly as possible. When in enclosed ground, use strategy and tactics. When in death ground, fight.
There you
Is
go.
that-
Very
Is
good.
that it?
Yeah,
Okay.
that sounds about right. Yes.
Yeah.
So we'll go to Jason's translation, and then yeah, this is one that actually we could spend a lot of time on.
Okay, so I was planning to, because chapter 11 is very difficult, and then it itself can be a book because it covers everything. So okay, so I'm going to skip the introduction of chapter 11. I'll save for next week when we begin it. Okay, so give an overview on chapter 11. I probably will make a table on the chapter 11 because the chapter 11 itself is much better structured, okay, organized in the 9 land. I call it the 9 ground, okay, in Chinese called 9地, same way. And then I think a lot of translators 9 situation. I think ground probably makes sense because the Chinese word is land, okay, but here the land is more situational land, and the previous one called the form of the land form. Okay, so basically more on the physical land, okay, physical ground. So that's a subtle difference. So I'm going direct to read the translation, and it could be very different from a different translator. And my goal is try to honor the original text, because in Chinese text only use 1 word for the each land, each situation or ground. So I have to pick the right word, the most close word. So that could be very different from other translation. So let me start. The Master Sun said, the method of military operation is to make use of 9 different ground: dispersive ground, light ground, striving ground, traffic ground, intersecting ground, heavy ground, difficult ground, encircled ground, or dead ground. Remember, we use the word "or" because we talk about the situation. So you will face one of these situation, the situation. So the words I pick, sometimes you probably will feel a little bit confused, but unfortunately, I believe each word match the Chinese character. Okay. So here, that's how well this chapter, Sun Tzu, they defined 9 situations. Okay, so number 1, ground within which feudal lords fight. Grounds within which feudal lords fight are dispersive ground. That's number 1. Number 2, grounds of others into which we enter, but not deeply, are light ground. Grounds which benefit us if in our possession, but benefit others if in their possession are striving grounds. Number 4, grounds through which we can go and others can come are traffic grounds. Number 5, grounds adjacent to a few feudal lords. He used 3. I think 3 means a few. Ground adjacent to a few feudal lords' territory, of which the first conqueror will gain support from the world, are intersecting ground. Grounds of others into which we enter deeply, leaving many fortified cities behind, are heavy ground. Number 7, grounds of mountains, forests, precipices, barriers, swamps, lakes, which are hard to traverse, are difficult grounds. Number 8, grounds with narrow entrance and meandering exit, where their small number of army can attack a great number of ours, are encircled grounds. Grounds on which we can either survive if we fight hastily or perish if we do not fight hastily, are dead grounds. Therefore, so Sun Tzu is going to talk about the strategy, how to deal with this ground in only 1 or 2 words. Okay. Therefore, do not fight in dispersive ground. Do not rest in light ground. Do not attack in striving ground. Do not be cut off in traffic grounds. Make allies in intersection ground. Plunder in heavy grounds. March through in difficult grounds. Strategize in encircled ground. Fight in dead ground. So that's the end of the first paragraph, and then
All I'm going to say for this introduction to chapter 11 is jargon. If you've ever listened to soldiers actually speak to one another, it's jargon. And what Sun Tzu is doing is establishing jargon. That's really what this is. Since we've only got 10 minutes, and this is the moment we kind of get to recap everything, I want to go back a little bit and go over some of my thoughts. I'll do this as quickly as possible. We began by talking about the value of a son and the role of a parent. And I couldn't help but think of the Ban clan, Ban Zhao, Ban Chou, and Ban Gu, who, if you're unfamiliar with these 3 siblings, they are very significant in Chinese history. One was a poet, one was a general, and one was a daughter. And that basically means, according to the Ban clan expectations, you had one who had merit, one who was striving for merit, and one who was useless. And the legacy goes to her. Ban Zhao is the most known of the Ban clan because she has an enduring legacy in the work that she wrote. The other 2 had, we'll just call them a mixed history. But these 3 siblings really represent, to me, what this question was after. What did a parent expect from children? What was a child's role to their parent? And why would Sun Tzu talk about your sons? Because daughters were a liability. That, to just put simply, they were there's an old oracle bone that asks the question, will the queen's birth be auspicious? And then they answer on the back, it happened at this time, it was not auspicious, it was a girl. That was the sentiment. You had to have children in order to ensure your future, not just your legacy, but literally your retirement to some degree. And to have a daughter meant you were going to be expected to shell out a dowry of some kind. And so it cost you something. The poet was the standout child of the family and the one who actually died in prison later. His brother, Ban Zhao, went to go and be a general to make a name for himself because he wasn't as smart as his brother. And he did actually make a really big name for himself and retired pretty well off, but was nowhere near as beloved as Ban Zhao, the sister who wrote a treatise for women. And her writings are incredible. I recommend them highly. She did the due diligence that a child was expected to do to honor their parents in that family dynamic and tradition. And she did it despite not being born a son. But she could be considered an exemplar of what any Chinese father would hope for their son to be for them. As far as other thoughts, we moved on to the perils of war, and Peter was talking about, the escalation of war as it sort of became detached from this one-on-one familial relationship. And all I could think of was Verdun, which, if no one's ever been to Verdun in France, it's the site of the longest continuous shelling of World War I, and the ground still contains arsenic and will not grow things. It's also the site of an ossuary, where there were simply so many bones, they could not distinguish one side from the other. They referred to World War I as a meat grinder because of that impersonal touch of the industrialization and mechanism and detachment of war from superior to subordinate. It was the really first industrial war, and it was ugly, like very few wars were prior to it. And so we have in centuries learned the cost of war. After World War II and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, nobody wanted to drop a nuclear bomb again. We enter a Cold War. So we have these minor proxy wars, which are not minor to the people whose country they're taking place in, but it's not the Soviet Union battling the USA. Instead, what you get is a crucible there of intelligence gathering. The Cold War becomes this pressure cooker for developing the skills of heightened intelligence gathering and utilization. So when John was talking about this premium of intelligence in warfare, this is really sort of the training ground and proving ground on which it developed. And we consolidated it, and the Soviet Union fell apart, so it never consolidated it nearly as well. One of the reasons is we own intellectual property in this country, which is not something that exists in many other countries. And one of the reasons why it's so valuable. Talked about that value of an iPhone going to us versus to China, and the premium we put it in on intellectual property. Our systems of checks and balances allow us to own something as ephemeral as an idea. And that really wedded its way into our intelligence gathering system as well. All of this lent to a competitive advantage against most of our competitors on the world stage. And then when we get back to, did Sun Tzu see all this coming? Probably not in detail, but he could have foreseen the moral of the story. What you know is infinitely more valuable than what you can do. This is the same lesson I grind into my safety training students. What you know is infinitely more valuable than what you can do, because with what you know how to avoid having to do, how to find out what you really can or cannot do.
That's incredible, insightful, and your students are very fortunate to actually have that insight. Very much so, because actually, yeah, we think we can do anything, but knowing what we can't do is actually just really an essential to survival. So we'll go with Ocean, David, followed by James.
Hi, can you hear me?
Sure.
Okay, so in order to respond to David a few minutes ago mentioned that it's not just about due diligence. Well, it's again still the other summary of this book is that Sun Tzu give us clear instruction of when to fight and when to avoid wars. And the United States being the most powerful countries, but even with all the tens of thousands of nuclear heads we have, you know, after the September 11, George Bush declared certain countries are real enemies, and we attacked Afghanistan, bombed the hell out of the countries, and we attacked Iraq, and kill over over 1 million innocent people. But other countries, like such as North Korea, why we haven't attacked them? Because our leader is smart enough to follow the Sun Tzu. Do not attack countries or enemies that can. In other words, North Korea has the nuclear bomb right now, and now they have the ICBM to launch in Washington D.C. So if we would attack North Korea, there's a great potential that our country is on the fire too. So our leaders are smart enough to follow the Sun Tzu's instruction to not North Korea, even though our President Bush labeled them as equally threat to the. So we're already doing it. So thank God. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ocean. We'll go to David.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reading here about mental preparation, about knowledge and calculation. But I think there's still more, spirit is more than just the calculation. You can't just know what the troops should do. They actually have, you can think you know what they do. I mean, you can never really know. So there has to be something that is going to make it work, which the cohesion has to be real. The force has to be real. Their training, their respect, their love, their discipline, it has to be real. And you can be trusting in it, and then if it fails, you can say, you didn't do the due diligence. I don't think that's the results that happen, you win or lose, you can always point and say, they didn't follow, Sun Tzu's rules. They didn't have the right, and then tell me something that's wrong. But this is about what you can do before it's happening. This is about going into the situation. And yes, the intelligence is a huge part of it, but it has to be something more. Like Russia had their intelligence about the Ukraine. They never had an idea what the spirit was. And they couldn't have known because no one in Ukraine even believed it. And Zelensky was a clown, and they went in and he's not a clown anymore. Something happened, and it's inexplicable, but they were something no one was prepared for. No one knew this could happen, that they could survive. So, due diligence, blame Russia for not knowing that there are 100,000 troops and superior weapons, this country 10 times more in their army. Nuclear weapons, something else is going on. And it just might be heaven in this case.
It is interesting sometimes that, the things that absolutely cannot be calculated, and especially when someone is, or a country is, willing to maintain their way of life and their culture, the way, and there's something deeper there. I agree with you, David, when it's your culture that you're trying to.
And we'll explain it after the fact. Oh, guess what? That was a difficult land. That was a narrow pass they went in. We're going to use the language of this book to describe it, but we didn't really know what it was until it happened. So yes, it's good to have the intelligence. So when you fail, you didn't know something. You'll hopefully learn from it and find it out afterwards, right?
Right, absolutely. I mean, there is and I think John actually alluded to this as well, is there's the theoretical aspect of it, and then there's the practical. And this kind of has both. So I think that you make a very good point. So you need to leave, Jason.
Yeah, I need to leave in about 5 minutes. So if you have any question about the text, let's say if you want to question or you have comment on the text, then please. Yeah. Otherwise, I will.
Yeah. Does anybody have a question about Jason's translation? Now's the time to ask.
But it's more difficult, and then you can say that's a lot of question, or you can say it's not important because.
I only have a general comment about the text, Jason. If you want to wait, it's up to you.
Yeah, you have a comment, please.
Yeah, so I feel that this chapter is a change, a big diversion from the rest of the book. This is I think this is about situational thinking and situational classification. And when I read the chapter, I definitely got the impression that it could be turned into a spreadsheet. You could take these situations and probably vertically, and then the horizontal, which is usually the fat part of the spreadsheet, would be the edification of the detailing out of the different limitations, possibilities, possibility thinking, situational thinking. So I think that's a big difference. And I really appreciate what John said earlier about, he called it algorithm, but it's really a model. You could take the whole book and turn it into a model of thinking about warfare, and then apply any kind of methodology you wanted to that model, which is what I would call an algorithm. So so the book itself is a very large model of war thinking, and this chapter 9 situations is a point of departure, situational thinking about basically engaging and limiting strategies. Basically, the whole chapter is about much more about limiting strategies than it was than what occurred previously in the book.
Yeah, I think thank you, James. I think I'm on the way to make another spreadsheet, a table to this one, because this one is more organized. And my primary interest may not be that in the strategy, military strategy. My primary interest is about logic, how ancient people think, what's their logic. That's my primary interest. That's why I'm interested to make a spreadsheet on this one, because they will make it clear how ancient people think things. Okay, so I think that I can make a promise and make a spreadsheet, so make it easier.
Yeah, no, I very much appreciate that. I've been thinking about that. Not only your tables have always been very, very helpful in making it
because
clear.
I always think about how people convince, how you convince people, right? That's a big question. So for the ancient Chinese, they use Chinese language, and sometimes I read in Chinese sounds convincing, but in English sounds not that convincing. Why? Okay, so that's the question. I like to find out. So it definitely is a long way to go, but that's that's my primary interest on everything. So and I mean, I think that Mark, you have some tough question. I'd like to take your challenge.
Jason, this is a very easy. I'm sorry to disappoint you. It's just, are these 9 grounds, situational grounds, mutually exclusive, or can they overlap?
Okay, good question. I know. So do you remember I put all on this one at the end? When I put the all, so that means exclusively could be one of that. So it's a situational. Okay, so it will face one of that. And the bigger question will be, how does it related to the chapter 10? which I translate as length form, right? They have the 6 length form. So that's my interpretation. Chapter 10 is talking about the physical form or functional ground or physical ground. It's functional. And this one is situational. So basics really not just the land itself. When you look at the bird's view or satellite picture, you cannot decide what kind of land it is. You have to depend on the situation, the weather, the enemy, the third party country. Okay, they all related, and how strong the enemy are and how strong or we are. So that will be different situation. So I think that's a little bit more complicated, but that's my general concept on this. So hope I answer your question.
Yeah, actually, Mark, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
Well, yeah, what I was thinking was that, for example, the first seem to be mutually exclusive because one is in your own territory, one is in a hostile territory.
Right.
But either of those could be contentious ground, and the difficult ground can also overlap with contentious ground. And it's not just that there's only one kind of ground at any time. It could be a multiple situational situation.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. Sorry, I interrupt you. Okay, because I thought of this problem before. I'm not a big military fan. I'm no interest on the military operation. I'm interested in the literature. I'm interested in the philosophy. I'm interested in the logical. I'm interested in the moral issue, not in the military. But I read this one and I thought about this. I think the situation is the previous one, then form could be more objective, okay? And you can objectively decide the situation, the then form. That's why Sun Tzu talk about a general need to know yourself, know your enemy, and know the then form suitable for fight. This one is subjectively view of the then. So it is a heavy land, it's a light land, it's a dispersive land, it's dead land. Actually, the general will decide. Okay, so it's a mutual situation, right? You decide this one is light land and what strategy you have to use. So that's subjective. Okay, that's my non-military interpretation on this. So the reason I do this, logically makes sense. Okay, I'm not saying militarily makes sense. Okay, logically, I think it makes sense.
I think that that's a very good point. I mean, if you look at the particulars for both, contentious ground and difficult ground, they do differ in how their actually functions are. But I can see, I could definitely see how difficult ground, if you were to just take it as difficult and contentious, that you would see those two as overlapping. But there is a distinction that's made throughout the text as far as when to initiate an attack versus actually when to maintain steady and keep marching along. So I think that there's that distinction between the two. It's in the particulars. So I would look at this as you have to read the details underneath them about how they're defined in order to see that they are mutually exclusive.
Yeah, okay. So actually, that's a long way to go. And then I will stop here for now. And then the reason we make the 9 situation or 9 grounds for today is if you can think about it, for 1 week. And the next week, we can focus on the text and we can talk about how to do it. But of course, if you are interested in the military or interested in the application in the real life, that's one way to look at it. I just have to tell everyone my interest is probably more on the logical and the literature and on this side. So I will not argue for military advantage of this book. I will argue for the logical sound, okay, on the translation. So that would be my purpose. So yeah, anyway, yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
And
I would just thank you, Jason. As always, I mean that was, I'm really anxious or not or excited to see the tables come back, because I really do think it would be interesting if you could draw the entire text out. I mean, it would be. I think there's a way to do it.
Unfortunately, the chapter 11 is not just ground. It includes. That's why before I'm planning to talk about chapter, because it also includes many things. A big part is psychology. Okay. And the psychology on this part. So we probably will do is they talk about the land and then talk about psychology, then go back to the land, then talk about some moral. So it's a little bit, confused in a way, but we will go through this, because I think Amang and I also spent this one spent quite a long time to translate, because almost stuck there. Okay, thank you everyone, and then I'll see you guys next week. And then it's a lot of work on this one, even for, it's easy to say that's not important, then we jump away, we talk about something different. That's fine, that's another way to look at, because we are not going to do the army, then soldier, foot soldier fighting anymore, but but if you want to get in, then that's a lot of work. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, as always. Very much appreciated.
If I could just point out to what Mark is saying but also